Welcome to Culture Screen, where we analyze culture through countdown. Today's episode is on Cuba, a New History by Richard Gott. We will be reading off 7 interesting facts you didn't know about Cuba. The following quotes are read directly from Richard Gott's book, Cuba, A New History, published by Yale University Press in 2004. Number 7. The Tainos were not the original inhabitants of Cuba. A more ancient people on the island were the Guanahatabeyes, who themselves were migrants from the forests of the South American countries that are today Venezuela and Colombia. The Guanahatabeyes were then driven to the west as a result of the arrival of 2 subsequent waves of migrants, the Tainos and the Ciboneys. Page 12. Number 6. The first Indian resistance chief to be recorded in Cuba was actually from Hispaniola. On page 13, Richard Gott says, not until 1511 was an expedition sent out from Hispaniola to Cuba. Velázquez had orders to conquer and settle the island, but his men were greeted with stiff Indian resistance that would last for several decades. The first leader of the indigenous forces to be recorded was Atui, a Taino cacique or chieftain, originally from the island of Hispaniola. Number 5. The Spanish found less gold than they had estimated. On page 16, Richard Gott states, the Spaniards had come in hope of finding gold, and they were pleased to find it in the rivers and the hills of the Orient. Yet supplies were small, and the deposits were soon exhausted, lasting for little more than 25 years. Cuba sent 84,000 ounces of gold to Spain in the first 30 years, but production had declined steeply by 1539 to only 650 ounces. Number 4. The Spanish were the overwhelming minority on the island of Cuba. On page 20, Richard Gott states, the population of the island in 1544, according to one contemporary estimate, was less than 7,000, made up of 5,000 Indians, 800 black slaves, and only 660 Spanish settlers. After 30 years of settlement, the settlers had barely a toehold. Number 3. 40% of Spanish men on the island of Cuba married indigenous women. On page 22, Richard Gott states, a census in 1514 in Hispaniola showed that 40% of the officially recognized wives of Spanish men were Indian. One authority concludes that a large proportion of the modern population of the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Cuba is able to claim partial descent from the Tainos. On page 22, Richard Gott went on to say, in most cases, succeeding generations of mestizos claimed the name and language of their Spanish forefathers, yet they undoubtedly carried the culture and genes of their Indian mothers as well. Number 2. There was a royal decree in 1543 to expel all Muslims from Cuba. On page 25, Richard Gott states, a royal decree of 1543 ordered the expulsion from Cuba of all slaves from North Africa. Quote, because the Negroes who live in that part of the Levant say that they belong to the Moorish or Mahometan caste, and as others would associate with them in a new land where the Catholic faith is now being implanted, it is against our interest to introduce such people. End quote. Number 1. In 1649, there was a yellow fever epidemic that killed a third of the island's peoples. On page 35, Richard Gott states, Cuba's population remained static during these years of isolation and totaled little more than 30,000 in the middle of the 17th century. Slaves continued to arrive, but few white settlers made the journey. A disastrous epidemic of 1649 killed perhaps a third of the island's people. We upload new videos every week, so subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the like button as well. Click the notification bell to be notified of when we upload these videos. See you on the next episode of Culture Screen.